Hi, everybody. This is Mr. Edelman here with another remote learning session for all of you. Thank you so much for watching these on YouTube. It's really heartening, especially in this, difficult time where we're isolated from one another, to get such positive comments and questions connected to our learning sessions together. So thank you so much, and I encourage you to do the same, especially given the context that today's headline of the day is something that I'm sure will resonate with all of you. It is, are New York State Regents exams canceled due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic? And the sub headline reads, New York State Regents canceled due to coronavirus? That's a question because it hasn't been decided yet. Various people and students are waiting to know the answer, but no formal announcement has been made so far. All right, so let's use this major probing question that's on everybody's minds to do a few things. Let's use it to review some very essential concepts in US government and economics, and then perhaps make some predictions about this, given what would be some reasons that would prevent the Regents exams from being canceled this year and also in the future, and what would be some reasons why the state might go ahead and cancel exams, not just for this year, but in future years as well. So I really like this topic. I like this topic because it connect. All of you are very interested in it. It's relevant. It's real, and it also connects to some of the civics work that we did. In terms of a shout out to our period one class that was in Chalkbeat this year and was looking at their action civics projects of how perhaps doing away with the regents and changing the way that we do assessment and graduation can elevate authentic learning. Okay. So, a few things. What's a Regents exam? So, I'm sure if you're watching this, you know this already, but if you're not in my class or you're not a student in New York State, it's a graduation requirement. It's an exit exam for being eligible for graduation. So there's 10. They're over here. In terms of what's required, you need to pass at least 5. And there's been some slight changes made over the past year or so where you could substitute one exam, so pass 4, and then do something else like pass a career and technical education exam, pass like a certification exam, so a dental or pharmacy exam that you guys take your senior year, or perhaps what was the focus of our the Chalkbeat article that we were in was to demonstrate civic engagement mastery. So like something like a capstone project for civics, which is nice to see, which is something similar to what we did in terms of our action civics. Okay. Now let's talk about a little U.S. government and how this connects to government. So one of the most important features of our government is we are a federalist system. What does that mean, federalist system? That means that we don't have just one government. We actually don't have just 2 governments. We have often 3 governments, right? The 2 biggest features are our national government, the government in charge of our whole country, which is located in Washington, D.C., and our state governments, and every state has a capital. Ours is in Albany, that's in charge of the state, right? And we also have, we talked about local government as well, right? And so it's important to understand there's powers that are specifically given to the national government, powers that are specifically given to the state government, and powers that are shared. Other terms that you need to know in terms of what this means: if something's a national power, that is also known as an enumerated power. It's enumerated in the Constitution, that's given to the national government. If it's a state power, it's a reserved power, it's reserved for the states. And something that's shared in the middle of this Venn diagram is known as a concurrent power, because it goes through both the national and the state powers. Okay, so if you look here, you can see very clearly that the power to set up schools and maintain schools is a state power, right? There's really no ifs, ands, and buts about that. But just like many things, there's still ways for the national government to try to influence those things. And we will talk about that in a little bit. Okay? That's our little review of US government in terms of connecting. Okay. So let's look at what this thing is called, the Board of Regents. All right. This is something interesting to consider. So what sets New York State separate from the rest of the country is these people that have the most say over our education policy and how education is facilitated in our state, they're not appointed by the governor or our head executive. All right. So Andrew Cuomo did not pick any of these people. They are actually picked by the New York State legislative branch or Congress, right? So that's different. So Cuomo has very indirect control over education in New York State, as opposed to in New York City, right? When we think of the chancellor and who appointed the chancellor, it's our New York City mayor, Bill de Blasio, right? So the executive has more control in the city, but in the state, it's actually the Congress that has more control. Okay, this is Chancellor Betty Rosa. She's the chancellor of the Board of Regents, and this is Adrian Nan Eileen Mead, who is in charge of our district, our first district. You can see that her address is on Broadway in New York, New York. And so my first period class has contacted her many times with the research and their thoughts and our projects in terms of changes that they might want to consider for the Regents and for graduation requirements in New York. Okay. So when we're talking about any sort of government bureaucracy, right, people that were elected, it's hard to reach a consensus on anything. And given that, it might be more likely that the state just doesn't act. It would be hard to if there's no way to facilitate these exams, right? But in terms of going into the future, right, it might be easier often to just keep things in place as opposed to invoking major big change. All right. And talking just about tradition, that it's easier to keep things in place that have already been happening. If you look at if you look at the history of the Regents exams, right? This is an archive of every Regents exam that has ever been given, right? 2020. If there are exams given in June and over the summer, they would be right over here. Let's go back down, all the way to 1866, right? Which is when the first Regents exams were given. Actually, 1 year after the American Civil War, we have Regents exams. Go figure. It's actually not a coincidence. So there was a lot of emphasis placed on education after the Civil War in terms of rebuilding not just the country, but our education systems as well. And that's why you see the introduction of Regents exams. Alexander Hamilton was actually a member of the Board of Regents as well. Okay. And so here, you could actually look. You can see the first Regents exam ever given in 1866, which was a arithmetic or a math exam. Okay. So there's a long history of giving these exams in New York State, and perhaps whenever there's a long history of something, it might be likely that it continues and it maintains consistency. Okay, let's talk about some reasons why the Regents exams might be ended, not just this year, but in future years as well. So we said that education is a reserve power given to the states, right? It's a reserve power given to the states. That doesn't mean that the national government doesn't try to steer or affect education in the states at all. Often they do. And one of those big changes occurred during the Obama administration. Let me go back to this. Okay. So during the Obama administration, there was a grant program called Race to the Top. And so since the national government didn't have the power to tell the state government that they had to do what they wanted to do for education policy, they would do what anybody would do. They would bribe the states with grant money. So if the states were willing to put certain restrictions and policies into place, they would get funds from the national government. And New York and many other states were states that signed on to this. And in doing so, New York State got $697 million. And I think this was a year. I don't think this was overall. I think this was every year. Okay. Most people don't know the name Race to the Top, but many people do know the name Common Core. And Common Core Standards was something that came out of this Race to the Top grant that was proposed by the national government. All right. And so what was Race to the Top? Much of it was tests and testing. It placed a high emphasis on testing, that states had to demonstrate growth, that students were learning more, and the way that that's typically been done, unfortunately, is through exams. Okay. And so what has happened due to that? So there's been huge backlash in testing, especially testing in elementary schools. Because I don't know, I think there's a mentality that we think that it's okay for high school students to sit in rows and to spend a lot of time doing prep and test taking. But we care more about our elementary school students, and they should be having fun and learning interesting things and being active in school. And so we don't want to see that. And so as a result, all across the state, there's been parents that have been opting their kids out of the state exams, the from grades 3 through 8. Um, and you can see, there's inconsistency based upon socioeconomic status. So in New York City, you can see the opt-out rate is fairly low; it's about 3%. But in other places, and especially if you look at low needs areas, so outside New York City, so like this is Long Island, the opt out rate is as much as 35%. That parents are just keeping their elementary school students at home during these exams because they don't want them to be exposed to all this, what they would think is unnecessary and uh, low engagement testing. Okay, so um, what's come out of the what's come out of the national government in regards to education now? So this is Betsy DeVos. She is was appointed by Trump to be the in charge. She's the Secretary of Education for the national government. And the most recent statement by her was on March 20th. She enacted a policy that said that helping students adversely affected by school closures, Secretary Betsy DeVos announced a broad flexibility for states to cancel tests during the national emergency. So she said that any state that was affected by the pandemic, that they could be released from the testing requirements. And that's not really surprising because she's a very big believer in states' rights and the national government playing less of a role in in steering the states towards education policy. Um, right? So again, like typically like Republicans, they want to give more power to the states and less power to the national government, and had actually, Trump and like Davos herself said that they would love to close down the education department that is controlled by the national government. So this isn't all that surprising, and given the fact that now the national government is giving the states leeway to do away with the exams, especially this year, right? This gives the states more comfort and perhaps flexibility in canceling the Regents exams for this year. And another thing as well is if we go back to this idea of race for the top, right? This has ended. This was an Obama administration national grant program, and it's ended. So now there is this amount of money is not necessarily tied to exams in the same way. So New York State doesn't necessarily need to worry about, oh, if we don't administer these exams, we're gonna lose out on more money by the federal government. So that's something also as well that puts New York State in a unique time to rethink how they want to do assessment in New York, especially because they are bound by their agreement to enter this national program called Race to the Top. So all of those things, the fact that Race to the Top has ended, the fact that we're looking at inconsistencies between opt-out rates and who's in favor of tests and who's not in favor of tests, um, looking at issues of equity. These are things that make this a bigger issue, and a possibility that this might be the most unique and opportune time to end the regencies altogether. Last thing, there's a huge petition going around. I'll put a link to this if you feel